Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at our webinar today. We're expecting about 40 guests, so we're just going to give it a minute for everyone to log in. I'm really pleased to be welcoming two guests today to join us in discussing some of the themes that have emerged from our research and looking at some solutions that we can offer in Wales. So I'll be talking about our cost of learning in lockdown research and the data that we gathered from families in Wales. And I'm also joined by Gwen Hardy from Citizens Advice Cymru, and Gwen is going to talk about some research that she has done into the kind of financial impacts of the coronavirus pandemic and possibly what we might see happening later on this year with regard to household finances. And we're also really happy to be joined by Dr. Steffan Evans from the Bevan Foundation, and Steph has just published a new report into child poverty in Wales, looking at some of the policy levers that we have available here that could be used to address what has been a long-standing problem, but it's becoming more complex in light of coronavirus. So I'm really happy to have both of these guests with us. For those of you who don't know, my name's Ellie Harwood. I work for Child Poverty Action Group. I'm the Wales Development Manager for our Cost of the School Day programme in Wales. I'll tell you a little bit about the programme and the research that we've conducted. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes about the research and what we found from the families we spoke to in Wales. We'll then hear from Gwen and from Steph, and then there'll be an opportunity to answer some questions. So you'll see while you're joining us now that your camera is off and you're muted, and that's just so that we don't get interrupted by other people's screens flashing up when people are presenting. The chat function is open and I'd really encourage you to use it. Please do introduce yourself in the chat and feel free to discuss what we're talking about. My colleague Kate Anstey, who's the UK lead for the Cost of the School Day project, will be in the chat and she'll be able to kind of answer some of your questions. She'll be posting links to some of the research that we're talking about. And as I say, we also have opened up the question and answer box, and that means if you've got questions for any of the panelists, pop them in there. We'll have a look as the session is running on, and hopefully we'll be able to kind of talk about some of those towards the end of the session. So we're hoping to finish at midday. I know a lot of people have got other Zooms to be going on to, so I think we probably had enough time now for people to come and join us. So I'm going to get underway and I'll just start up the presentation. Okay, so here we go. Right. As I said, my name is Ellie Harwood. I am the Wales Development Manager for Child Poverty Action Group's Cost of the School Day project. For those of you who don't know, the Cost of the School Day programme aims to create a fairer education system for children and young people who are growing up in poverty. And the project is delivered by Child Poverty Action Group in partnership with another charity called Children North East. We've run this programme for 5 years in Scotland, and we are now funded by the National Lottery Community Fund to roll this work out to whole school communities across Wales, Scotland and England. The programme has various strands of activity, and the majority of that work is actions to poverty-proof education settings. Practitioners use participatory research methods with children and young people to create meaningful change in their schools. We examine institutional practices and policies that place cost burdens or cost barriers within education, and then we kind of work together with the whole school community to identify and remove those barriers. And in doing so, it kind of promotes inclusion and equal access to all the opportunities that education can offer. And we also have, a policy, a research and an advocacy function within the programme. So obviously during lockdown, we have found that, we can't go into schools and carry out the kind of poverty proofing work that we have been doing up until now. So we were looking for other ways to kind of engage with and understand some of the impacts of coronavirus, particularly as kind of learning's moved into the home. So, we have kind of a long history of working with schools to help reduce poverty-related barriers to engagement. And what we do know is that schools have a really important role to play in addressing poverty. If we think about poverty being caused by inadequate incomes and excessive living costs, which result in people being unable to kind of participate in the things that are taken for granted by others in society, schools play a really important role in reducing cost pressures on families whose incomes aren't enough to get by. So they enable digitally excluded pupils to get online, and they provide access to ICT and software. Schools in Wales provide free breakfasts, and for many children also free school dinners. Schools print off worksheets, and this is something that comes out hugely in the research, which I'm going to discuss today, is that the amount of families who don't have printing facilities at home, and schools are a really important institution in terms of providing access to printed materials. And schools lend out books. And a statistic that really stays with me is that there are 400,000 children in the UK who don't own a single book. They don't have a single book of their own. So schools have a really important role to play in enabling children to access these most basic of learning materials. And as well as providing tangible or physical resources, schools also provide pastoral care, and they ensure that pupils are safe and they're happy and they're able to thrive. For many children, school is the only place that they get to see friends. It's the only place where they get to play outside, and it's the only place where they can participate in sports and the arts. And many families in Wales just simply don't have sufficient incomes to be able to provide these things at home for their children. So we know that prior to the current pandemic, children growing up in homes below the poverty line, they're already at risk of greater risk of poorer educational outcomes and reduced well-being, and they have increased barriers to engagement and participation in school life. And we know that certain groups of children face a much higher possibility, much higher risk of living in poverty. This includes children from Black and minority ethnic communities, children growing up in larger families with multiple siblings, children growing up in lone parent households, and children in homes where someone is disabled. So, our research shows really clearly that the kind of risk factors around poverty are really being magnified by the coronavirus pandemic, and potentially increasing some of the negative risk factors around children's sort of outcomes in education. So we know that COVID-19 will have an impact on poverty in Wales, but we are yet to kind of have very strong data on exactly what that impact has been. Steph and Gwen will go into this in a little more detail later on in the webinar, but we know that there were 180,000 children living in poverty before the pandemic. The majority of these children are living in households with at least one adult in work. Gwen's research has shown that 40% of Welsh households have seen a drop in their income since the pandemic began. We know that the 250,000 Welsh workers are now on furlough, so that's about a quarter of the workforce, and in some areas it's 1 in 3. It varies across the country depending on the labour market and the kind of shape of the occupations that people do. We know that there's been a really significant increase in universal credit claims, and whilst we are not quite yet seeing unemployment data rising, and we're still waiting for those kind of statistics to come through, there's real evidence that lots of people are moving into what's called economic inactivity. So they're not necessarily moving into the unemployed and claiming out of work benefits, but that they have stopped working. And we think there might be a link around some of the issues with school closures and lack of childcare. And some modelling that's been done by the Institute for Public Policy Research suggests that an extra 200,000 children in the UK are likely to fall into poverty as a result of the pandemic. And so the kind of picture that I'm showing here really is, a metaphor that I think really sort of demonstrates the experience of COVID, which is that we may well all be in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. Some of us have also been fortunate enough to be handed life jackets by the government, and there have been lifelines thrown out. But there are lots of people who are unfortunate and they haven't been provided a lifeline from the government. So we're just beginning to see the first kind of emerging impacts of what this crisis will be doing in terms of child poverty. Although it's very difficult to predict because of the volatility of the situation with the virus and the public health measures in place, it's quite likely that we will see more significant poverty rates. So that's kind of the background context as to why we decided to do this research. Was that at the start of the pandemic, we started seeing some research emerging from other organisations who, were saying that children in low-income families were doing less schoolwork at home. So, often this was kind of quantitative research that just, said that certain groups were doing 2 hours a day and some were doing 5 hours a day. There perhaps wasn't so much kind of asking why or what was really going on in these homes. So we know that, different groups of workers were either on furlough or were being expected to continue working from home, and that there were gender differences in how households were managing childcare and also continuing to provide education at home. But we really wanted to sort of understand more about what lockdown has been like for families with school-age children, with a particular emphasis on the impact in households who are living on a low income. So our research really set out to kind of map what resources are available in different households. So we knew, that it's quite well understood that a lot of households perhaps don't have access to the internet, but what other resources perhaps are missing that prevent families from being able to participate in remote learning. We really wanted to identify good practice, because we were hearing lots of stories from the front line of how schools and councils were going above and beyond to support families. We wanted to capture and share that good practice, because that's quite a strong part of the ethos of the programme that we run. And we wanted to gather feedback on the systems of support that have been put in place. And as a tri-national project, we were able to kind of have oversight of the way that 3 different governments have chosen to use their devolved powers in different ways to support families. And we were particularly interested in how people who were on the receiving end of those systems felt that they were working. And one of the aims of our research was very much to listen to seldom heard groups, and that includes children and young people, especially those with lived experience of poverty. They're very rarely consulted and included in decision making that affects their lives. So we always set out with the research, we weren't intending to collect necessarily a representative sample of the whole of the UK. We wanted to focus very much, on people who were users of these systems and who might be experiencing additional challenges. So it's worth saying, that we're not attempting to say with any of the research, either at a UK level or a Welsh level, that this is representative of the whole country. We were aiming very much to carry out qualitative work that gave us the answers to why these things might be happening, and to look quite deeply over quite a broad range of measures at some of the themes and how they interact with each other. So what does it mean to be on a low income and a lone parent, and to have, a child with special educational needs, disability, so we were trying to kind of understand, from quite a to gather rich data, I guess, around people's lived experience. And we also carried out some interviews with participants as well to try and really kind of probe deeper into some of the barriers they were facing. So in Wales, we didn't have a very large number of participants compared to other parts of the UK. Our survey was in the field at the same time as several others, and so we weren't able to disseminate it through some of the mechanisms we used, particularly in Scotland, where it was sent out through schools and local authorities. So we spoke to 76 parents and carers who between them had 132 school-aged children. 95% of the parents and carers who took part were female. So we had 2 men and 2 parents who chose to describe their gender in a different way. A third of the people taking part were in lone parent households, and 41% of the families were in receipt of means tested benefits. And in our report, we refer to these as low income households, and across all of the measures that we examined, we have broken down respondents into what we call better off families and low income families. So where we use the term low income, we just mean in receipt of means tested benefits. 22% were in receipt, had children in receipt of free school meals. This is higher than the national average, and as I say, this is slightly skewed by us really wanting to gather the experiences of families who are using these systems. And 42% of the families in our study had experienced a drop in income due to COVID-19, so it's sort of broadly in line probably with what's been found by Citizens Advice and other organisations. And we also engaged with 17 children and young people, so 10 primary pupils and 7 secondary. And the families were drawn from across Wales, so we have people from every area. There were a couple of counties where we didn't get any respondents, but we have got a mixture of urban and rural, north, south and west Wales in there. So we were really interested, first of all, in, what resources did families actually have available for them to be able to learn at home. And what we found was that low-income families were more likely to tell us that they didn't have all the resources that they needed for their children to take part in learning during school closures. So 45% of the low-income families said they didn't have everything. They were missing at least one essential resource. And also a third of the better off families as well. And I think it's worth pointing out that, it's quite common even in better off homes for people to be lacking at least one thing that they actually really needed to be able to participate in learning. So then the next question really was, well, what actually is missing? So half of all the families that we spoke to who said that they had something missing mentioned that they were either lacking kind of devices, data or connectivity, so ICT resources. And I think this is probably the missing resource that's been discussed the most, particularly as kind of education has moved from the school into the home, and suddenly remote learning has become so much more important. But it's not just the case that people actually have a laptop or a broadband connection, because many families did. But what we heard time and time again was that the household only had one device, and it was having to be shared between the parent or parents and children, and they were all competing for access to this one computer. And what I guess makes the pandemic, obviously a unique situation compared to sort of just doing homework in normal times on the weekend, is that parents are trying to work. So everyone is competing with each other really to be able to kind of get on the computer. Another thing that really comes out in the research in Wales and in other parts of the country is that people don't have printers. Now, I alluded to this before, and I think even as an organisation, who spends a lot of time mapping what's missing in homes, I was just astonished by the amount of people who don't have access to printing facilities. This was a real barrier for people, particularly primary age children, who were being sent a lot of PDF worksheets via Hub. They can't be edited online, so you can't actually work on them on a computer. Even if you have a computer, you have to be able to transfer them out into the real world. And for people with much younger children, the children don't have the IT skills to be able to kind of work on a computer on a worksheet. And so you know, we heard from families who'd literally resorted to handwriting out these worksheets in order for their children to be able to do them. You can imagine the level of frustration for some of those families. So more than a quarter of the Welsh families we surveyed had to buy a printer during lockdown. You know, and it's obviously not just the issue of buying a printer itself, but the ink as well is incredibly expensive, and people have said, you know, they'd had difficulty obtaining printer paper and ink even if they did have a printer. So we looked a bit deeper then into well, what, you know, resources had families had to acquire during lockdown. And in our research in Wales and in other parts of the UK, we found that low-income families were much more likely to have reported having to spend money on educational resources during lockdown. So this data is for Wales, and it's broadly in line with what we've seen in other parts of the UK, but there are a few small differences. And essentially, you know, when we looked at different types of resources and what proportion of families in each of the two groups, either low income or better off, had reported buying these things, you can see that low income families have spent money, are more likely to have spent money on most resources, apart from tablets and laptops, for which they're equally likely. We also used another measure of sort of financial insecurity, which was asking people how concerned they were about money. So they were able to rate themselves from 1 to 10 on a scale of kind of, you know, being extremely concerned about their finances up to having, you know, no worries at all. And what we found at a UK level was that people who reported being extremely concerned about their finances, a third of people in that group had reported having to buy a laptop or a tablet during lockdown. So you can see, you know, that where we're hearing about families facing big drops in income, they're also facing quite large increases in having to spend money. And if we're sort of, you know, one of the reasons we think perhaps that lower income families are having to spend more on sustaining learning in lockdown is simply that they don't have these resources in the home already. So when we know how many households are struggling, for example, to be able to afford food and to be able to afford heating, you know, learning materials in the home are just an additional luxury that we really can't necessarily afford to shell out for, and that schools massively help in offsetting the cost. So whereas better off homes might well have a craft cupboard full of kind of, you know, things that can be used to make things, children might have access to a wide range of stationery and so on, and, you know, and books in the home. It's less likely in low-income homes that parents have been able to stock up in ordinary times for these kind of things. So it's worth thinking about, you know, as schools return, how can we provide families with these kind of learning materials, and to see this as something that's quite a large problem for a lot of people. It's you know, it's perhaps more pronounced than any of us were aware. So we've heard some really good examples of how schools have helped families overcome this lack of resources in the home. So families have told us that, you know, they've had staff dropping off stationery. Obviously, a lot of families have now been provided with internet-enabled devices and dongles, and people are extremely grateful for this support. But we have heard from people who haven't had anything, and also people who just haven't been asked if they need anything. So I think, you know, there's perhaps assumption sometimes that families, you know, have, because the parent has a job, that they can manage, but our research has really picked up that this isn't necessarily the case. The other thing to point out when it comes to resources and learning resources at home is that it's not just about pens, pencils and printers. The intangible resources are just as important. So physical space to be able to work, the access to a chair and a table which to sit and do your work is something that is not available. So many families are living in overcrowded or extremely compact housing. Children telling us that, you know, they have to sit on the floor, or that they have to, you know, work on their bed all the time. And what's different, again, I think in the kind of lockdown scenario is that people have to, you know, we've got parents working at home, siblings, everyone all kind of inside, all trying to work. And what is interesting. We didn't pick up so much in Wales, but very strongly in our research in Scotland, was that one of the biggest disruptions that children reported to their own learning was their parents. It was their parents working from home at the same time. So we had particularly teenagers saying, it's my mum who's on Zoom all day. You know, we've got these video calls coming into the home. So you know, parents' work is coming into the home, disrupting learning. It's noisy, and it also means the parent is not available to support the child. So when you're thinking about assessing resources that are available, asking the question, does the child have a parent who can be there to support them, you know, who's available, or is that parent distracted, or is that parent, for some of the young people we spoke to, you know, parents are key workers and they were going out, they were, you know, young teenagers at home all day with mum out working as a nurse, and they were just left alone in the house all day. So, you know, there are kind of questions around, say, workspace, but also around kind of whether parents are available to support learning. We had a lot of interest in replacing free school meals, and we were quite lucky really with this study that we were able to capture people who'd had experience of receiving support in different forms throughout lockdown, because as you know, schools first closed, most families were having to go and pick up grab and go lunch boxes and so on, and then some moved to food delivery, and eventually the majority of local authorities have moved to cash payments. So we were able to ask people what they thought of these different systems of support and what worked well for them. And families were overwhelmingly positive about getting money paid directly into their bank accounts, because it gave them that choice and flexibility about where to shop and what to buy. And this really helped them to stay safe and maintain social distancing. And we had quite a lot of families with children who had specific dietary requirements, and also some parents who ate special diets for medical and ethical reasons. So, you know, this enables, obviously cash enables families to acquire food that meets the specific dietary requirements of their families. And we also had families who were shielding, and this by having cash, it meant they were able to transfer the money to someone else to go and shop on their behalf, which was extremely helpful in those circumstances. We know that 2/3 of children who receive free school meals in Wales live in lone parent households. So the cash transfers were really valued by these families, because you can imagine, you know, if you are a lone parent and you don't have access to a car, you perhaps don't have access to public transport, you've got to take your children with you every time you go shopping. Anything that kind of makes it as simple and as flexible as possible for you to do that really helps. So people were very positive about the fact that they were able to kind of meet their needs in the most dignified and flexible way by using money, and just that cash transfer was also really helping them to kind of cope with the financial stresses of having children home. It's worth saying that we asked a lot about you know, how families were keeping in touch with school, and we asked young people as well, you know, what kind of support they were getting, and we had a look at the relationship between frequency of contact and then how much schoolwork young people said they were doing. So one thing that came through really clearly in the data from Wales was that families really valued schools that checked in on their well-being, and that includes the well-being of parents. And this was mentioned much more than support with teaching specifically, but people just, it's kind of, you know, it's really important to emphasize that this made a big difference to how well people felt they were coping during lockdown. So yeah, you know, where schools have made that effort to really kind of you know, reach out to families, that's been very appreciated. And you know, I think some of these quotes really illustrate just what it means to families. You know, and we had a lot of examples, particularly in Neath the Talbot, of the way that schools have been reaching out and continuing to engage with communities. So we did ask people about how they felt about returning to school, and obviously we are now witnessing pupils going back into the classroom this week, and the majority of children will get a chance to check in and catch up over the next few weeks. So for the children and young people in Wales, as we found across the UK, it was the desire to see their friends and to be able to play, that absolutely mattered more than anything to this group. So they just wanted to be able to catch up with their peers. And it's interesting to note that it's often those parts of the school day that perhaps don't necessarily have an academic purpose that young people were most looking forward to. So break times, school dinners, after school club, you know, that's being able to feel that sense of being connected to young people your own age. And it wasn't just young children who expressed their desire to play. You know, from the youngest child we spoke to was 5, the oldest was 19, and even, you know, the teenagers were also equally keen just to see their mates and to kind of mess around and to have fun, really. So it's been really great to see the pictures of children going back to school this week and hearing reports of how schools have enabled that to happen. And I think when we look at what parents and carers told us, which is that they really want schools to prioritise children's well-being and mental health. They're not as concerned about catching up on lost learning. So the kind of words that parents use are, please, you know, nurture them, be gentle with them, understand it's been difficult. And you know, we have had a very varied experience of lockdown. Some families have actually had a relatively pleasant time, and we must remember there are positives for some families. Around a third of the families that we surveyed in Wales and in the rest of the UK said you know, that learning from home was actually enjoyable for them. They liked it, it was going well. These families were much more likely to be in better off homes and to have you know, all the resources that they needed. And we shouldn't be surprised if some families elect to continue learning at home in the longer term, I think, after this. But for 2/3, it has not been an easy experience. You know, families have found it very challenging, and being on a low income means that you're much more likely to say that you're much more likely to say that learning from home has been challenging and that you just really want things to go back to normal. But parents were expressing a lot of concern for their children's mental health and well-being, and they really saw schools as being able to provide support around that. So just sort of in conclusion, some of the points to consider, I think, is that you know, we believe poverty proofing of schools is more necessary than ever. Given that we expect child poverty rates to rise, and also that those children who are in poverty may well be in deeper poverty when they return to school, having poverty aware approaches, policies and practices in schools is so important. And we might need a broader understanding rather than just using free school meals as a proxy, which I know Steph will talk about in a moment. But you know that poverty is actually affects a much bigger group of pupils than simply those who receive free school meals. We would really urge educators to have open conversations with parents and carers and children as well around the missing resources in their homes, so both the tangible and intangible. So really asking those questions about, you know, not just do you have a laptop, do you have a printer, but really understanding, well, how many other children are in the home, and you know, what competing demands do their parents have on their time, do they have space to work, and then thinking about how these things can be provided, either through lending or, you know, looking at being flexible with some of the support schemes that are available. And we also really want to urge you know, schools and everyone who has contact with families to think about promoting access to financial entitlement, because we asked families, you know, have you been able to get information about how to access some support if you're in a difficult financial situation? And what we found was that the families who were the most concerned about money were also the most likely to say they found it difficult to understand where to go next and where to get help. So people who had less concern about money actually said it was easy to find out about entitlements. And I think this speaks to some extent around, you know, issues with digital inclusion and being able to kind of find your way through what can be quite complex and opaque systems for getting financial support. We found some really good examples in our research of how schools have been proactive in signposting families to financial support, making them aware that they could be claiming free school meals, that they could access the discretionary assistance fund, that actually there is, there are pots of money out there that people can apply to if they're facing hard times. And families need to hear that advice from an organisation that they trust. There's a lot of risk and a lot of scamming going on around COVID. Schools are a place where people go and they trust that as a source of information. So I think there's a role that can be played there. I'm going to finish there because we want to pass on now. So I'm going to pass over to Gwen, who is going to talk a little bit about the systems advice research. And this is just kind of giving a snapshot, I guess, of some of the bigger issues that might be at the moment.
Hiya, thanks Ellie. Yeah, I'm just going to talk really briefly about the impact that this pandemic is having on household finances, and particularly why lots of families are having to get by on a lower income at the moment. So I'm sure everyone's aware that the coronavirus crisis is having quite a devastating impact on lots of people's jobs and incomes. So in the first few weeks of lockdown, the number of people contacting Citizens Advice Cymru for help about employment problems is nearly 4 times higher than the same period last year. In April, we commissioned some research which found that 17% of people in work, or around 250,000 people in Wales, had seen their hours cut, been laid off, or been made redundant as a result of the outbreak. And as Ellie said, we found that 4 in 10 households had seen their overall income drop as a result of the crisis. And I think it's worth mentioning, whilst we did see a big spike in problems around March and April when there was a huge amount of uncertainty, these issues are still ongoing. So at the moment, the number of people we help with redundancy is 3 times higher than the same period last year. And it seems likely that that trend is going to continue sort of into the autumn. So we've seen lots of really welcome interventions from both the UK and Welsh governments, and particularly programmes which help to protect people's incomes. So that's things like the furlough scheme and the scheme for self-employed people, but not everyone is covered by those programmes. So research from the Standard Life Foundation has found that 12% of people in Wales who had seen a drop in their income weren't able to access those schemes. And just to give you an example, we had a case, someone who came to us, it was a parent with 2 small children who'd just started a new job in the months leading up to the crisis, and therefore wasn't eligible for furlough, and she lost her job. She has since got into financial difficulty. She's fallen behind on her rent, and her landlord has issued her with an eviction notice and asked her to move out in the first week of September. So the gaps in support that people are falling through are having kind of immediate impacts. We're also seeing lots of people whose employers have chosen not to furlough them, and in this issue it particularly affects people who have health conditions or who have caring responsibilities. So for them, their jobs kind of may have continued during this period, but they've not been able to do them, particularly if they're looking after children, or as I said, they're not able to leave the house because they're shielding. And so some of those families that we're helping are managing on sick pay, or some of them have been taking unpaid leave. For other groups, sometimes their best option is to claim benefits. So we're seeing lots more people relying on the benefit system at the moment. So as Ellie said, I think it's around 100,000 people in Wales have moved on to universal credit just between March and May this year. That's a 64% increase in Wales, but it's nearly doubled in places like Powys, Gwynedd and Ceredigion. So benefits are a really vital source of income, but in some cases they aren't enough to cover your costs. And so whilst there have been some positive changes to the UK benefit system since the outbreak, at Citizens Advice we're still seeing people who are struggling to make ends meet because with what they receive through benefits. And that's particularly true of people who are subject to the benefit cap or the 2-child limit, both of which tend to mean that the amount that someone receives doesn't reflect the kind of real costs that they're facing. And we're also seeing people struggling during the initial wait for payment under universal credit. So Citizens Advice recently published research. Sorry, I've got building work in the background, so if you can't hear me, just let me know. Citizens Advice published research which showed that more than half of UC claimants had faced hardship during the 5-week wait for their first payment. And that included things like having difficulty affording essentials like food or heating or keeping up with bills. So I think the point that we want to make here is that the income shocks that people are facing at the moment and that we're likely to see in the coming months, in all likelihood, they're going to translate into longer term financial problems for some people, really through no fault of their own. So major life changes, and particularly income shocks, they're a driver of financial distress. And for that reason, we think it's likely that more people in Wales are going to be pulled into poverty or kind of fall into debt as a result of this pandemic. So again, the research that we published in April, we found that nearly 300,000 people in Wales had fallen behind on one or more household bills, such as gas and electric or broadband. And a third of renters in particular had said they'd fallen behind or they expected to fall behind on their rent. And our research found that people in shielded groups, young people, people in insecure work were most likely to be affected. And we think, so that research was from April, we think it's likely that we're going to see those problems get worse in the coming months. Firstly, because financial problems and debt problems, they don't always manifest immediately. People kind of have savings, they might wait some time to kind of address some of these problems. So we had some research which predicted that the number of people needing help with debt is going to increase by over 60%, and it's not going to peak until the end of 2021. And I think it's worth saying as well, the being in debt, being in arrears on those bills, it's an additional pressure on families, and it kind of constrains how they spend their money. It also can have a really negative impact on mental health and well-being. The other reason that we think things are likely to get worse, at the moment there are several temporary measures in place which protect people from extra harm during the crisis. Those are starting to be lifted at the moment. So just today we saw pause on conditionality within universal credit, within the benefit system being lifted. And that means that technically people might start to be sanctioned again if they're not fulfilling their job search requirements. But other kind of protections, so towards the end of the summer, we're going to see things like the pause on evictions, which has meant that people have been able to stay in their homes even if they're kind of falling behind on their rent. We'll see bailiffs will be allowed to visit people's homes again, so kind of putting additional pressures for people who are in debt. And I think most importantly, the furlough scheme is due to be wound down as we sort of move into autumn. So we're very worried that we'll see more people kind of in a really uncertain place about their employment or even losing their jobs around that time. So just talking about what can be done, I think some of the things that we're asking Welsh Government to do is around extending those temporary protections or kind of like strengthening the protections, so to kind of mitigate or minimise the impact that these financial problems will have on families. But another thing that we'd like Welsh Government to do is support people to take up all the benefits that they're entitled to. So we know that not everyone claims everything they can. Before the pandemic, we conducted some research and we found that 1 in 4 people in Wales said they delayed or decided not to claim a benefit despite thinking they could be eligible. And the 2 most common reasons for delaying claiming a benefit, the first one was worry about how they would be treated by officials, and the second most common was that people felt it would be too much hassle. So there's 2 kind of barriers there. The first is there are still really negative perceptions and potentially some element of stigma around claiming benefits, and that could put people off finding out more information. It might make them feel that that kind of thing isn't really for them, and it also could push people to think that they'd just rather try and get by without. And the second kind of barrier is the kind of practical barriers. So we know benefit system can be really, really complicated. It can be difficult to know if you're eligible, and in some cases you need to provide lots of evidence to kind of support your claim. And I think there's an added complication for benefits where you have to apply online. So for people who are digitally excluded or find it more difficult to find information online, our research actually showed that people who were digitally excluded, they were much more likely to have delayed or put off claiming benefits. So as I said, we want to see Welsh Government doing more to make sure people are taking up their entitlements. I think ideally we want to aim for that information to reach people at an earlier stage and reach people who wouldn't necessarily think to check if they're eligible. I think at Citizens Advice, a lot of the people that we see, they come to us when they're at a crisis point, and we're always trying to reach them earlier, but we know that there's stuff that Welsh Government and other kind of organisations can do to help with that. I think there's two kind of things that are backed up by evidence as being effective. So we want to reach people kind of through relationships and messages that resonate with them. So that can be through people or organisations that they trust and they're already in touch with. And it can also be at kind of big life moments where their circumstances have changed and they're kind of looking for information about what that means for them. And one of the main examples there is when someone loses a job. And the second kind of piece of work that we'd like to see is kind of identifying and removing those practical barriers that make it harder for people to claim benefits. And really that's around just minimising the amount of work that people have to do to find out about their benefits and just to get through the process to get that money coming into their pockets. That's pretty much me.
Thank you so much, Gwen. That was
Sorry
really
about the building work if that was interrupting.
I've also got building work outside my house, so we're really doing well with this, aren't we? So I'm going to hand over now to Steph. And Steph, if you could just tell us a bit about the report that you've published this week and some of the solutions that Bevan are proposing around tackling child poverty in Wales, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie, and thanks for the invitation to come on to speak at this webinar as well. So the report we published yesterday was, I guess, the latest in a series of reports we've been publishing on a broader project looking at how low-income families in Wales are supported by the Welsh Government. You know, whenever we talk about kind of social security and benefits, you know, the tendency in Wales is always to talk about what's going on at Westminster and about, you know, do we need further devolution of powers, rather than actually thinking about some of the benefits we've got controls over here already. So things like free school meals, the council tax reduction scheme, DAF. You know, so this project predates the crisis, but we think the crisis has made the case for thinking about these benefits differently even stronger, given how many more people are now going to be relying on these benefits. As Ellie mentioned, we published the latest report in that series yesterday, focusing particularly on children. Some of it's posted on our website, but if anyone wants to discuss anything further, get in touch. I'm sure I'll be in touch with some of you on this call anyway, as the week goes on, as I get a chance to disseminate the report further. The previous reports we published on this, we published a short one last September on the administration of free school meals and the pupil development grant access, so that's for school uniform grants. So a lot of that work fed into this report as well. And in terms of children, we've published one as well looking at support for people in post-16 education as well, kind of outside of universities. So there's quite a lot we've done kind of more broadly. But in terms of this one looking at children, we focused on free school meals, Healthy Start vouchers and pupil development grant access, because these are schemes that the Welsh Government either directly control, or in the case of Healthy Start vouchers, you know, there's some kind of shared responsibility with the UK Government on that. But they provide absolutely huge amounts of support to families across Wales. So if you look at just free school meals by itself, in the 2019-20 school census day data, there were 85,000 children eligible for free school meals, with about 66,000 children taking up their entitlement on that day. So really massive amount of support. But we sensed that these weren't being delivered in the most effective ways and maybe not helping as many families as they could. So over last summer, we spoke to a range of families at different sort of community events. We also spoke to a lot of stakeholders, and many of you on this call played a role in that. And we're looking to do more of that over the summer as we try and draw this project to a close. And through kind of that process, what we found was that whilst families really value the support that's available, there's probably about 4 main issues with it at the moment. So firstly, not all families living in poverty can get access to support. Secondly, the process of applying for support is complicated and kind of puts people off on kind of the stigma issues as well. Thirdly, the value of support isn't always enough. And fourthly, there are other living costs associated with raising children, which isn't covered by the schemes. So kind of just to quickly go through each of these issues kind of by themselves. So In terms of families being locked out of support, there's two main groups. So firstly, people without recourse to public funds are obviously one group that's affected. There is stuff going on with, at individual local authority levels around free school meals, but obviously that varies from local authority to local authority. But maybe the largest cohort in terms of numbers are people who are living in poverty and are on universal credit, but are not eligible for free school meals or Healthy Start vouchers or the uniform grant because their earned income is too high. So, they've been deemed in need of support by the state. We know they're living in poverty, but they're not able to get support. And when the Welsh Government changed the eligibility criteria around that, at the time there were about 55,000 children living in poverty that were going to be affected by it. I think it's fair to say it's likely that with the impact of COVID-19, that number is probably going to increase, as well as the number of children who are eligible for it as well. So there's a huge number of children there not eligible to get support. In terms of the application processes then, there's big variations between local authorities. Some are doing really clever stuff, so that if you get council tax benefit, council tax reduction scheme, they automatically passport your child onto free school meals. There are other local authorities, however, where you have to apply for everything separately, and sometimes when there's no real need, because under the changes to free school meals eligibility criteria, transitional protections mean that if your child was eligible at the start of primary school, they don't need to reapply, even if their circumstances change. So we're seeing big variations there. Also issues around stigma. We heard from parents, about the impacts of some stuff in schools, in terms of the way things operated, and actually some parents being put off as well by saying, well, I don't actually, I think I'm okay. I'll leave someone else get that support because they need it more. So, it impacts both ways as well. In terms of the support coming up short then, there's big variations in terms of the free school meal allowance that families get in schools. So we found that in one local authority in Wales, you get £2.30 a day to go towards your school meal. In another, you get in the one with the most generous allowance, you get £2.95. So, that's a meal a week, in essence, when you count up that difference. Now, there's various reasons for that. It's around kind of the cost of providing food, and you'd expect to see some variations maybe between authorities. But there have been concerns highlighted previously by other research that the allowance in some local authorities may well not be enough to provide families with support. And we know there's issues around breakfasts as well, and also with Healthy Start vouchers, that the value of those haven't increased for a number of years. And then finally, in terms of other costs, you won't be surprised really in terms of the stuff that keep coming up over and over again. So we heard a lot about school trips and extracurricular activities. These even small stuff like £1 to dress up, or own clothes days. Well, if that happens often enough, that can be too much for some families, and kind of means that pushes them into trouble in terms of poverty, but also kind of locks them out to some opportunities available for other children. School holidays, again, was another issue that came up, and not just with regards to holiday hunger, but also around kind of the cost of activities. £1 give an example of, going to St. Fagan's Museum may be free, but by the time you're there, by the time you buy an ice cream or, pay for parking or paying to get there, it quickly becomes an expensive day, if you're on a very tight budget. Other costs then, kind of essential foods and clothing, so beyond school meals and beyond school uniform, these are still costs that parents are struggling with anyway. And then finally, childcare. We know there's the childcare offer, but there's some significant issues around that for children on low income. So in terms of what we think should be done, the report kind of argues that firstly, we think all the existing schemes in Wales should be pulled together as part of the broader Welsh benefit system, because we think that gives us an opportunity to think a bit more holistically about what we're trying to do with all these schemes. So instead of coming up with another solution for a particular problem, why don't we try and put more money into maybe one of the existing schemes to help more families, and that might have knock-on implications. But beyond that, though, we think there's some kind of specific things that could be done with existing schemes as well. So firstly, we think eligibility criteria should be relaxed so that anyone who receives universal credit gets access to these schemes. We think, the state has deemed you to be in need of support if they've decided you're eligible for universal credit. So why do we have further arbitrary benchmarks? We think there's issues, things we could do around the application processes. So can we learn from those authorities that have managed to auto-enroll families onto these schemes, and can we apply that across Wales? There's also stuff around working with schools and communities as well, in terms of what can we learn from schools that are doing stuff really well around stigma to get that more broadly, and then also maybe in terms of banking some of the wins we've seen already over the current crisis. So free school meals are going to be provided over the summer holidays. Can we keep that going on a longer term, but also bearing in mind the need for some additional sort of support, so things like the SHEP programme, are still going to have a massive role to play, we think, going forward. That's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through kind of what's in the report. As I said, if anyone wants to get in touch with us and discuss anything in it further, we'd be more than happy to do that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Steph. So we're getting very near to time. We've got one question in the Q&A. I think this is probably one for you to answer, Gwen. And it says, in terms of digital exclusion, is there any outreach support based in community settings such as hubs or libraries where people can access online resources and forms for benefits and have one-to-one support to complete that? So perhaps calling the LA and booking a time to meet with someone who can walk through the form. So I know Citizens Advice have a help to claim service for UC, and perhaps you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think there are definitely those resources like before the lockdown, and with Help to Claim we have kind of public computers available to help people with claims. So I think if anyone's struggling, that would definitely suggest that you refer them to us, and we have a dedicated helpline for universal credit claims in particular. I think there's an additional difficulty at the moment because so many of those places are closed. So I think it's something that as things start to open up, we really need to think about kind of like prioritising that. There are, I think our service is doing a lot to reach people at the moment. So we're still delivering advice by telephone and email and web chat, but we're looking for ways to reach people for whom those channels wouldn't necessarily be like the most comfortable. But I think we're still concerned that there are people out there who for whom face-to-face is just the best way of getting advice, and we're kind of worried at the moment about that they maybe aren't getting the support that they need. So I think it's definitely something that as we start to open up, we'd ideally like Welsh Government to kind of prioritise.
I think just to add to that, that's one of the things that came through our work as well, was that it's a bit hit and miss as well in different parts of Wales, and even within locations in Wales. So we spoke to some parents who spoke glowingly about health visitors who'd help them with Healthy Start vouchers, about people at the hubs who'd help them with stuff. Other people at the same locations we were going to were saying that they hadn't had the same experience, and therefore they'd found the whole process far harder. So it's about giving maybe staff time and giving staff training to be able to do that as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's the thing, there are no simple solutions to a lot of these issues. And I think the same with tackling poverty, we need action at every single level in public services and civic society, from the individual interactions between professionals and members of the public, right up to strategic change, in terms of schools and local authorities, and then government policy as well. We have to really take action every point. But I think, we've heard a lot of, to be honest, quite difficult and upsetting data today, and it is upsetting. I think we are facing an incredibly challenging time for people on low incomes, and I am really concerned about children living in poverty and what coronavirus is going to do for their childhoods. But one thing we do know is that poverty is policy responsive. We've managed to reduce child poverty before, and it is actually possible using policy to eliminate child poverty altogether. So I don't want anyone to sort of lose hope or feel that we can't actually do something about this, because we know how to tackle this. It does require, unfortunately, change that where some of that power lies outside of Wales, but I don't think we should lose sight of the potential that we have within our existing systems and within some of the support schemes that you've discussed today, and also in the roles that all of our public bodies can play, and that includes schools, that includes local authorities, in making life easier and protecting children. So whilst we might be facing a really enormous challenge in terms of poverty as a result of the pandemic, I think this is the point now where we all really need to sort of look at what we individually and hopefully can do to kind of address some of these issues. So we've reached the end of the session. I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today. We will be making a recording of this webinar available online, and the link will be circulated. So I know there are quite a few people who wanted to join us but weren't able to. Once again, thank you ever so much. Kate has shared links in the chat, I believe, to the various pieces of research that we've discussed today. But of course, you can get in touch with any of us, and I'm sure we'd be happy to talk about that further. So thank you so much for everyone's time. I hope you have a lovely day, and that you get to have a little break now between this and whatever your next Zoom will be. And I'm sure I'll see some of you in the future, hopefully in the not too distant future.